Gaby, Poler-Buzali, and Dr. Greg Fonzo, welcome to the Thought Room. Thanks for coming today. I'm so happy to have you here. I'm really honored, as I was saying before we hit record, to have the two of you. We were introduced by a mutual friend and colleague, Dr. Martin Polanco from the Mission Within. And he's a director who works with veterans in providing support for PTSD and traumatic brain injury through the use of psychedelic assisted therapy and retreats. And we're going to get into a lot more of this topic today with the project, the center that the two of you are pioneering. And like I said before we hit record, I feel like the two of you are a part of working behind the scenes to create a very powerful movement at this point in our human history. I'm very honored and excited to be able to shine a spotlight on two unsung heroes, in my personal opinion. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedules to come be with me today. I'm wondering if, briefly, we're going to get into the story of how the Center for Psychedelic Research and Therapy at Dell Medical was started. But if you could just briefly talk about, respectively, each one of your roles, and then we'll dive in.
Sure. Thank you, Haley, for inviting us. It's a pleasure to be here. So I am Greg Fonzo. I'm the co-director for the Center for Psychedelic Research and Therapy. I'm a clinical psychologist by training and assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry. My role is really to be I guess you could say, one of the thought leaders in the center, along with my other co-director, Dr. Charles Nemiroff. And so we are involved in really designing studies, procuring funding with the help of my comrade here, Gaby, and really executing on some of these plans that we have in order to really inform the development of the psychedelic research field.
Beautiful. Thank you.
And my name is Gaby Poler-Buzali. I have been at Dell Medical School as a senior director of development. So I basically lead all fundraising efforts for 3 departments: neurology, neurosurgery, and psychiatry, which makes the Mulva Clinic for the neurosciences at Dell Medical School. So I've been just extremely excited to have found Greg and to have had a little part to do in getting this center up and running.
A little part. Come on now.
I don't know why, even though I was a dancer when I was young and center stage was my comfort zone, it's really hard for me to be comfortable on center stage now. So I like the behind the scenes look.
Oh, yeah. This is my favorite thing. I'm so glad to shine the spotlight on you. You two are highly deserving. The center is the first of its kind. Is that correct? In Texas?
That is correct.
Yeah. And I think I read somewhere that Texas has the second largest veteran population. Is that correct? Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I believe that is also correct. Texas has a huge concentration of veterans, particularly Central Texas, the area that Austin's located in.
Right.
So that's sort of one of the reasons that we're kind of focusing on that population in particular.
Yeah, let's go into that a little bit more. Why are we focusing on the veteran population? Why is this population of interest to you and psychedelic research in general?
Yeah, well, I'd say there's many reasons. One is, firstly, because there's such a huge part of the local population here that we definitely want to try to optimize and serve them and their mental health as best as we can. But I think the other parts of it, too, from a scientific perspective, are that veterans are, exposed to generally high degree of trauma, right, in the form of combat and early childhood trauma as well. There's a very high prevalence rate of that in the veteran population. And so because of that exposure to stress and trauma, they are suffering from a lot of the conditions that we in particular focus on, things like post-traumatic stress disorder, major depression, and various addictive disorders. So, and then kind of in addition to that too, veterans have really played such a huge role in pushing forward the normalization of psychedelics for mental health treatment in Texas. There was a House Bill 1802, for example, was passed recently, which is essentially mandates that the state has to fund research in order to study, in this case, psilocybin for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder in veterans.
Let's punctuate that for a moment. This is a really big deal. This is
Yes.
a really big deal. So let's unpack it a little more. In layman's terms, this means that we are now allowed to do research using psilocybin or mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms, for the potentiality of treating some of these mental health disorders. That's groundbreaking news, isn't it?
Yes, I would say so.
And when did that come into effect? Was it September 2021, somewhere around there?
I think that sounds about right.
Yeah.
November.
Or was it November? Okay.
Okay, great.
But yeah, it is. I think the part that is really groundbreaking about it is the fact that the state would devote its own money to this, which is really something that is pretty pioneering for Texas.
Absolutely.
Really for any state in general, but in Texas in particular.
Do you have any inkling as to why now? Why would they do this now and devote their money to this cause?
Yeah, I think it's a confluence of factors, but I think one aspect of it is the fact that so many veterans were very vocal about the fact that they had been helped a lot by psychedelic treatments. And so there were various, VETS is one of them, fundraising organizations and groups that are sort of devoted to bringing attention to this, that had connections with people in the Texas political system. And I think through that process, they were able to educate them, demonstrate to them that, through personal testimony and other sorts of ways that psychedelics might be particularly helpful for treating a lot of the mental health issues that veterans suffer from.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I want to talk a little bit more about veterans.
Yes, please.
So a couple things is we are very focused on veterans, but also on their families. And actually the first study, which Greg will talk probably a little bit more about later, is on Gold Star spouses.
Can you talk about what that means for those who don't know?
Yes. So Gold Star spouses are a spouse who have lost a spouse in the line of duty, or I believe via suicide when they have come back. They're part of also calling Gold Star spouses. And so our first study is actually not on veterans, but on veteran families, because the veteran families also suffer from seeing their loved one with depression, with PTSD, and they tend to be forgotten.
Yes.
And so we are making a point that, yes, we need to heal the veterans, but also we need to heal their families. And so I wanted to say that. And I think also just in Texas, there is an admiration for veterans that maybe in other states in the country don't find. And a lot of the supporters that have come through for the Center for Psychedelic Research and Therapy at Dell Medical School have their number one priority has been, I want to help veterans. I want to help the people that are allowing us to be free in this country. I'm from Venezuela, so I do have a deep appreciation for this country because I'm here now and I know that veterans make that possible for me. So that's kind of on a personal level why veterans are important for me and why I feel I owe them. And then also just post-COVID. I mean, we started to talk about this center in the summer of 2020. And we have seen the exacerbation of depression and PTSD and anxiety and just all the different mental health disorders. Mental disorders that we've been dealing with, and how much COVID has made it that much worse.
Yeah.
So I really feel like the time was now for one of the largest public universities, such as University of Texas, to say we need to do something about it, and we need to do something about it now.
Absolutely. Beautiful. So the center is officially about almost a year. Is that correct?
Yes. Come this December.
Congratulations. And Gaby, I'd love for you to take us through the timeline, some of the major milestones in the last year and before that are responsible for this coming to fruition.
Sure. So I started at Dell Medical School in May of 2020. And then, they gave me the director, go ahead and raise $3 to $5 million, and you cannot meet anybody because it all has to be on Zoom.
Wow. That's tricky.
Which was very tricky.
Yeah.
And so on a conversation with my brother, Ariel Poler, he is an angel investor in California, and he was just starting to dive into the world of psychedelics. And he said to me, you really need to figure out who's doing psychedelic research at Dell Medical School. So I talked to Charlie Nemiroff, who's the director of our department, and Charlie connected me with Greg. And Greg said, I just applied to the NIH for this one study to combine psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy with brain modulation techniques or neuromodulation, such as the TMS machine, which he'll talk about more later. And I said, well, let's try to get some private funding for this one study. And my brother's like, you need to get in touch with Tim Ferriss. And I was like, okay. So,
okay.
So through some connections, Tim was gracious to give us a Zoom meeting in October of 2020 with Greg and Charlie. And at that, he listened to Greg and his one study. And at some point he paused and he said, one study? You guys want to raise money for one study? You should start a center.
Wow.
This is Texas and everything's bigger in Texas.
Wow.
I think you should start a center.
Wow.
And so I always will credit Tim with his permission to that he gave us a seed idea and planted the seed for us to start this center.
Thank you, Tim.
Yes, indeed.
Well done,
Yes.
sir.
Yes. And we really took the next 6 months to figure out why we were important, why the center needed to be here, and realized, that's when we realized, wow, the second largest veteran population lives here. We realized that the current centers at the time were all in the coasts, right? So in the East Coast and West Coast, and there was just nothing in this part of the country. We realized that no large public university had a center, so we would be the first ones to do that.
In Texas.
And by
In
center,
Texas.
you mean one specifically focused on psychedelic research? Yes.
Yeah, there wasn't anything like that in Texas, and there wasn't. UC Berkeley is a public institution, but it's a lot smaller than UT.
Yeah.
So
but that's right. Yeah, one focus specifically on psychedelics.
Right.
Yes, and that is a center. That is just not one study only.
Yeah, I see.
And so then we started, creating all the materials, which my team, I couldn't have done this without the incredible development team at Dell Medical School that put all the materials together. And the leadership, really, Clay Johnston, who was our first dean, when Tim Ferriss said, you need to raise money for a center of psychedelics. I'm thinking, I'm in Texas. This is going to take forever to get approved. And within 48 hours, we got approval from the dean to say, yeah, you may go raise money for this.
Did that surprise you?
Yes. But it
was
showed
a very pleasant surprise.
Yes,
of course.
But it showed me that Dell Medical School is here to do things differently.
Right.
And is unafraid. And the leadership is very much supportive of this. That's how we got started. Then we got the first donation for the center, which was an anonymous donation in May of 2021.
Wow.
And at that point, we decided what the two projects were going to be that we were going to raise money for the center. And since May of 2021 till now, we have raised $2.5 million for the center.
Wow. Congratulations.
And they included people like Matt Mullenweg and Coleman Fung Foundation and Alfredo Frolic. And Paul Barnhart has been just an incredible champion. He's also a part of our board of the Department of Psychiatry, and he's a Longhorn. So it's been very exciting to see Longhorns from everywhere. Paul, in this case, is from Houston, and he's in the oil and gas industry. And for him to bring his community together, we had a dinner in April that he invited 50 people at River Oaks at his parents' house. And we had a veteran at each table telling their story about psychedelics. And
beautiful.
It was just incredible to see, people that were just curious but didn't know much about it. And we were able to raise $125,000 just in that one dinner. which all contributed to a crowdfunding campaign, just again to show you the level of support from the leadership of the university. They wanted to highlight the Center for Psychedelics in our crowdfunding campaign. And we raised in 40 hours $491,000 for the center.
Wow.
So,
which was way above the target from what I remember too.
Way above the target. Nobody thought that we were able to.
So what does that tell
raise
you? What does that tell you, that you were able to raise way more than what your target was?
I think we're at the right place at the right time for the right reasons to do the right thing.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it goes to show that this isn't a topic that really touches people on a personal level, you know, and
right.
If not people that have had their own personal experiences with psychedelics and maybe really benefited from them, but at least know others who might have, or have family members that are suffering from, you know, various conditions that psychedelics might be able to benefit.
I had the absolute astonishing honor of sitting in an ayahuasca ceremony with 20 military veterans. On the particular night that I sat with them, I believe I would have been, besides the facilitators in the room, the only person that was not a veteran in the space. So you can imagine the energy of what that was like. There were people from the US, there were people from Canada, there were people from the UK. This was witnessing this particular group that week was one of the most powerful trajectories of transformation I've ever seen within a small population. It was humbling and beautiful. It makes me almost cry to this day. And I believe one of your partnerships is with Heroic Hearts. Is that correct? So this is a funny synchronicity that it was Jesse Gould who brought this group of veterans. Jesse and I actually sat down. I was a brand new newbie podcaster, and he actually is episode 14 of this podcast. Now we're in the 70s, right? So
Wow.
we actually have an interview on this podcast with Jesse after he and I sat in that group of veterans. So the stories that I got to hear, the relationships, there were actually relationships that I made that week that ended up coaching with me years later, some of these veterans, and incredible group of people with amazingly huge hearts and really rapturously powerful stories. So everything that you're saying, I love how the veterans were at the tables sharing their stories, because that really is the most powerful way to spread these messages, is our own experience. So in that vein, I'm curious, you know, Greg, I was holding back my questions as we waited for Gaby to arrive. I was like, how do you find yourself studying what you're studying? You know, it's like you go into academics and research and you could study anything, and it's so broad. And how do you find yourself honing in on something like the brain and psychedelic research?
I think to put it succinctly, I think it's a mixture of patience, luck, and persistence. But to expand on that a bit, so I've had an interest in psychedelics for many years, probably since late to middle of undergraduate years. So this is back in the early 2000s. And at that point, none of this research was really going on. And if it was very much underground and or considered to be fringe, something that is not really a legitimate line of research.
Right.
And so at that point, you know, there wasn't really any opportunities to explore it or to really devote myself to it. So I decided to continue forward in mental health training and get my Ph.D. in clinical psychology. In that process, that's where I was able to learn various techniques like brain imaging and other kinds of non-invasive approaches to measuring neurobiological function, which is also very much a passion of mine and an interest. That is the neuroscience behind all of this. And, you know, so I kind of just pursued my training and then kind of watched the field evolve from afar. The initial studies coming out of Imperial College of London and Johns Hopkins University, which they've really done pioneering work in this area, and just reading, these articles with excitement and tracking them as they're coming out. I came to Dell Med to start my faculty career, totally not expecting to do this at all. So I got here in November of 2018 and had, just my little line of research that I was starting.
What were you researching at that point?
At that point, I was, and this is still ongoing. We're looking at how the brain circuits involved in responding to positive stimuli, like rewards and pleasant experiences, is impacted by the development of post-traumatic stress disorder. Because we know that people have sort of a blunted ability to experience positive emotions.
Yes, cool. I'd love you to talk more about that, actually, because that very much resonates with personal experience.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in post-traumatic stress disorder, the field has really primarily focused on what we might consider to be the fear-based symptoms, the hyperarousal, things related to learning the association between certain environments and being under threat, for example. And so there's a whole brain system involved in the processing of threat. And so the treatments we have for PTSD primarily are focused on trying to remediate the brain systems involved in threat processing and fear learning. But it really has ignored up until this point the whole other aspect of it, which is really this sort of what they call emotional numbing, or this inability to experience positive emotions,
right?
Inability to feel close to others, to have.
How exactly does that happen?
Well, it's ongoing in terms of understanding how that happens, but it does look like that the hypothesis that I have is that the kind of constant hypervigilance that people are under related to being in this state of fight or flight a lot of the time when you have PTSD essentially suppresses the brain's ability to respond to rewarding stimuli. But you can kind of think about them as two opposing circuits that kind of one inhibits the other.
Right. Yeah, this makes a lot of sense. It's almost like a really intelligent defense mechanism, and we can find ourselves relegated to a very short range of emotion for our own safety, right? Like I'm not going to let myself go into the low lows, and I also won't go into the high highs. Just anything that is stimulating in general. It's like, at least that was my personal experience of depression. And especially in like the low grade depressions that I've had, because I've had some more intense depressions, but in the low grade, it was just like kind of bopping around through life and just numb, like you said. Can't experience anything really delightful, or because I believe at least what was going on for me was there was some intelligent mechanisms at work that were keeping me from sliding deeper into the spiral, and just keeping me safe from being overstimulated from years of repeated trauma.
Yeah.
That
makes a lot of sense. I think the way you put it in terms of, if you imagine you're in an environment where your survival is at stake,
right?
Or at least you feel that way, that your brain is not really going to allow you to deeply enjoy things, in that state of mind.
Totally, because it would be safe to disarm.
Exactly.
Unsafe, rather.
Yes.
Yeah. Beautiful.
But yeah, so that was sort of that's still ongoing. We're just about to wrap up that study, but that was what I first started on when I got here, and have some other studies going as well, looking at various forms of neuromodulation, which is something that Gaby mentioned.
Yes. Will you talk about what that is?
Sure. So neuromodulation is essentially delivering energy into the brain in order to be able to try to change the way it functions. So the most primitive form of this is what they call electroconvulsive therapy. One flew over the cuckoo's nest,
right?
Kind of shock therapy, and that is fortunately not the kind of the way we do it nowadays, at least for the more targeted forms of neuromodulation. People still do go through electroconvulsive therapy, but it's usually kind of a last resort sort of treatment. So now we have other forms of treatment that are more targeted or focal, where we're not sort of stimulating the entire brain, but just a part of it, and much lower side effect burden, much safer. And the most common form of treatment nowadays for that is something called repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Cool.
Which is essentially, just like a coil that is, there's current passed through it, it creates a magnetic field.
Okay.
And when the coil is placed on the scalp at a certain part, depending on where you're trying to target, that magnetic field will cause the neurons about 2 to 3 centimeters below it to fire or depolarize.
Wow. Are they wearing like a cap? Or is it just you are putting the coil right on?
Yeah,
I want to like be in the vision of
like
what
kind
this.
of paint a picture for you.
Yeah, paint a picture.
Yeah.
So I'm coming in for this. What?
You could use a cap, but it's not necessary.
An electrode cap, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or usually actually they don't have electrodes in this. That would be what they call EEG or electroencephalogram.
Okay, yeah.
But that's a separate procedure. But sometimes they will use a cap for marking a target, for example.
Okay.
But it's not necessary per se. And the way that they used to target this was very kind of low. I'd say low tech. They would, find the part of your brain that where they would stimulate it, it would cause a muscle twitch in your hand, because the motor cortex essentially is accessible to TMS, and so they can find the spot where if you ping it essentially with a little pulse, it will cause the neurons that control your hand to kind of fire, and that causes the hand to just kind of have a slight muscle contraction. And they would measure about 5 to 6 centimeters forward from that as kind of the spot that they would target, which is a part of the brain called the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's very crude because people's brains are not all the same, right? So 5 to 6 centimeters forward in your brain is not the same spot as it is in mine, for example. So now we have more advanced ways of doing this. Some of them involve brain imaging, for example. Others involve sort of incorporating more information about the head shape and the size. But essentially, it can be done just on the bare head itself. It's a large kind of figure 8 coil, typically, kind of just placed right on there. There's a holder, and then it essentially what they're doing is they are repeatedly stimulating that brain area. And it's usually done at a high frequency, somewhere about 10 hertz, which is about 10 stimulations per second.
10 stimulations per second.
Correct.
Okay.
And that's done for, anywhere between 20 to 40 minutes, typically. Once a day, 5 days a week for 4 to 6 weeks is kind of the usual FDA-approved approach. There are newer forms of this now that are more accelerated, that can be delivered more quickly, and then have a what's called a patterned stimulation approach, something called theta burst, which is supposed to mimic some of the endogenous frequencies of the brain. And it seems to work as well. And it's a lot quicker to deliver. You can deliver in about 4 minutes as opposed to 20. So anyway, so that's I'm studying neuromodulation. That is one form of it. We're looking at a newer form now as well called ultrasound, or focused ultrasound, which is advantageous because we can hit a lot of the deeper brain areas with it, something that TMS unfortunately does not have that capability. But all that is to say that I was doing this line of research, neuromodulation, neuroimaging, and then I spoke to my boss, Dr. Nemiroff, Charlie. And, the reason was I put in requests to go and get training in psychedelic assisted therapy at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And so when you start as a faculty member, they give you what's called a startup package, which is, a certain amount of money that you have the, capability to spend with approval to sort of get your research up and running. And so this is one of the costs that I requested. And that sort of outed me, I guess, to them, that I was interested in psychedelic research.
Bold.
I figured, what the hey, right? I'm here, and I might as well go for it.
Good for you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And at the time, this was probably early 2020, somewhere maybe in the first 4 months or so. Or no, I'm sorry, 2019, early 2019. It had not yet reached that critical mass, the psychedelic research field, and so they actually denied my request to use these funds for.
Wow.
Yeah.
This is fascinating.
So I believe, and I think this is, kind of a testament to Dr. Nemiroff's ability to be flexible and to incorporate new information to change his opinion. But at the time, he was like, "You really don't want to get into this line of research." it's kind of I think the expression used, it's like pushing molasses up a hot hill in Georgia in the middle of the summer,
Yeah, that's a good one.
and I was like, well, I don't know about that. I think there's some value here, but I didn't fight it because I figured I would just kind of continue to be patient and wait for the right time to kind of push forward on this. So that time came around when there was a opportunity to apply to NIH, the National Institutes of Health, for what's called a high risk, high reward grant mechanism. It means essentially you propose a study that has a high potential to fail, but if it succeeds, also has a high potential for payoff.
Cool.
And so I thought, well, this is a perfect opportunity to write a grant on psychedelics. And I wanted to combine it with neuromodulation because I think it's going to be a particularly potent combination. The reason, I'll give you a little bit of the hypothesis here, but the idea is that we kind of know that psychedelics are valuable for many different mental health conditions. Things like addiction, depression, PTSD, for example. And I think the reason for that is because they have a very kind of non-specific effect on the brain that essentially allows the brain to become more malleable, more plastic, more able to kind of rewire itself. And we do know from some basic science work that's being done that psychedelics do enhance markers of neuroplasticity, like dendritic branching, for example, which is kind of like the ways that neurons will communicate with one another. And so the idea is that if psychedelics are enhancing this plasticity process and making the brain more plastic, more malleable, that neuromodulation would be like the perfect tool to try and shape that plasticity. And the example I sort of utilized, or the analogy, is that it's kind of like warming clay in order to be able to mold it into a shape and a desirable format afterwards.
Yeah, or it's like a shrub that's growing new tendrils, and then you're going in and doing the landscaping.
Yeah, that's a good analogy too.
You're welcome.
Like a bonsai. Yeah.
I'll allow you to use it.
Thank you. And so that was the hypothesis for this grant, and I proposed to do a study looking at psilocybin treatment in major depression, and then essentially follow that up with repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation directly afterwards. And the idea is using this design that we'd be able to see what the combination, how that might outperform either single treatment alone. That was the grant that I had just proposed to NIH when Gaby was hired at Dell Med. And she reached out to Charlie, my boss, and Charlie knew that I was applying for this, and we got connected. And then it was just sort of like one thing led to another, to another, to another. And now we are in this fortunate position to be able to push forward on this.
Wow. I am so fascinated by all of this. This is really cool stuff. So what you're doing, neuromodulation, is that what you're...
That's correct.
Yeah. So are you the first one to look at this specifically with psilocybin together?
As far as I know.
As far as you know. Cool. And what are you expecting to see?
The hope is that we will see that people that get both so there's control conditions in this design where we have a sort of a high or a very low dose of psilocybin as our two dosing conditions. And then afterwards, people get the actual real repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, or what's called a sham version of that, which essentially feels like the real thing, but you're not actually delivering energy into the brain. So the idea is that you're accounting for that placebo effect. But the hope is that the people that get both the high dose of psilocybin and the active RTMS, we'll call it that for short, because I'm really tired of saying repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Great.
That those people will have a much more profound reduction in their symptoms of depression, and that the benefits of the treatment will last for much longer.
Benefits of the treatment being the psilocybin, or really both paired together?
Yeah, the combination. So the idea is we would follow people, I think, for up to a year afterwards.
Okay.
And then really, the idea would be that, because usually people will start to relapse into depression.
Right. Exactly. And this is a major... this is what people refute about psychedelics most often when I talk to them, is like, well, people can just go into this almost like seeking and become addicted to just chasing with the psychedelics to maintain a certain state, and that it's not going to integrate, it's not going to last, right? Do you hear this criticism a lot?
Yeah, but I want to just refrain from using the word addicted, because that is a really trigger.
Loaded word.
Yeah, it's a loaded word for us, because people cannot become addicted. This is already proven that psychedelics is not addictive.
They're not physiologically addictive.
Right.
Yes. Thank you for saying this, because this is exactly the point that I want to drive home. And this is part of what the stigma is, right? I was even speaking with somebody yesterday, and they were like, well, we want to be able to, don't we want people to be able to source from within? I'll actually just say it was a conversation with my father. And we often, I'll go on walks, and my father suffered from a stroke about a year ago, and talking about psychedelics and traumatic brain injury is part of what we talk about as he's on his own journey of exploring questions about this. And he knows this is an interest area of mine. And he said, well, shouldn't people be able to do this work within without reaching for anything external? And I was able to really empathize with his perspective and also offer my own, having gone through many rounds of really major depression. And I said, every day I would wake up and feel like something was broken in me. And I was trying everything that I knew how. I was meditating. I was trying to read. I was trying to get out. I was trying to eat well. I was trying to see people. I didn't want to, though. And nothing was working. Nothing was working. And so psychedelics was a big part of me being able to pattern break. And how I describe it was like living life under an intensely weighted blanket, suffocating me, that I couldn't even get a breath of air. And what psychedelics provided me with, specifically microdosing psilocybin, and then eventually moving on to ayahuasca, was to be able to take my first breath in this life. And I'm celebrating that this year. I'm 32 years old, and I can honestly say that this is the first year of my life that I have not experienced either very serious or low-grade depression through this work. And it's taken me a lot of time to integrate all of this. So I was explaining this to my father, saying, these are tools. These are tools. The goal is not that we're constantly, and it's so new, we're just discovering the potentiality of these substances, of these medicines. And so his question was like, well, I see people out there becoming, and I'm going to use the triggering word, but air quote, addicted, because this is the misunderstanding that it's because psychedelics have, we're still breaking down the connotations of calling them drugs, right? And I'd love to just throw this over to the two of you, because you know more about this and even the history of psychedelics, but we're still breaking that down. And I think it's really important what you said to point out that physiologically, it only takes you drinking ayahuasca once to be like, I really would never want to do that again. It's not necessarily a pleasant experience sometimes. Obviously mushrooms and MDMA, these ones are, you're shaking your head.
Not for me.
Not for you. What was it like for you?
Well, I came at this opposite to everybody else. I started raising money for this. I had no idea what psilocybin was 2 years ago. I've never taken
way.
Never taken a psychedelic before, never taken anything before, no drugs, nothing. And
2 years ago.
Mm-hmm. No, a year ago. A year ago, I had not done anything. And I met Martine,
Yes.
He was very much a catalyst who introduced me to Paul. So then, money started coming in, and my conversations started, I was meeting all these veterans that said, I went from drinking a bottle a day. So it was like not only depression and, PTSD and suicidal ideations to addiction. And other things. And I just realized one day, I just said, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep having these conversations with potential donors and not really understand what integration was, because you can't really understand what integration is unless you go through it yourself.
Yeah.
And so I said, okay, I'm going to quote Charlie, I said, I'm going to become part of the anecdotal data. Because he always talks about, all the underground is anecdotal data, which we can't rely on, but there's enough anecdotal data for it to be studied and for the center to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had my first MDMA experience was in December. I threw up twice.
Mm-hmm.
All the feelings that came out were horrible, were all the sadness and pain and anger and shame and guilt that I've been pushing down for the last 44 years of my life. Because I'm happy-go-lucky Gaby, and I never get angry because I'm not allowed. I wasn't allowed when I was a little kid. Anger was seen as a bad thing, and I just wasn't cool. And so I've since then I've done another MDMA psilocybin together, which was probably the less difficult of the 3 experiences that I had, and then the last experience I had was just psilocybin, because I said, I want to do what the center's doing. And so I want to experience what psilocybin is. And that was, very much, I would never wanted to do this again. And so much so that the next day I felt, it was literally 5 hours of anger that came out. And the next day I still felt very angry, and that just wasn't me. And I called Greg, and I was like, I find it very ironic that the person that's in charge of raising the money for the center had an experience that was so bad that I was like, oh my God.
I'm so glad you're telling this story.
Yeah. I'm like, I can't keep doing this.
Right.
Like, this is what I'm raising money for. I remember being and telling the facilitator, I can't believe I'm raising money for this. Like, it was just so hard. And I called Greg the next day, and I was like, dude, I don't think I can keep doing my job.
Wow.
Like, this is...
And I was like, okay, let's talk about this. Drop everything for a moment.
Yeah. This seems important. Do you want me to come over?
And just the one phrase that said it all, I said, I'm so angry, and that's not me. And Greg turned around and said, but it is you. And I was like, but, of course, with integration afterwards, I am so grateful that I've done it. And I have never been clinically diagnosed with anxiety or depression or PTSD or any of that. But am I a completely different person? Yes. Do I think this is for everybody? No, because I was in the moment thinking, oh my goodness, all the people that I have referred, are they capable of surviving what I just went through? And I think obviously, our ideas of survival are very different, and I think we're definitely stronger than we think we are. But I think it's a funny story, because out of all the people in the world that have gone through this, and I am doing it because my job is almost calling for me to do it, and that my experience was so difficult and so hard, not the way Michael Pollan puts it on the Netflix, series.
I'm so glad that you're sharing this story, because I love the balance of it, and it really speaks to the importance of the integration process, because there's a lot of stories on this podcast about people having wonderful psychedelic experiences, and also ones that are really challenging. I think that's so important, so that people can develop their own discernment about all of this and hear this from a balanced perspective. And I'm curious, when Greg said to you, but it is you, right? And so many people listening to this may feel afraid of the idea of psychedelics, because it may elicit something within them that is uncomfortable, that is a negative, and I'm using air quotes here too, because I don't really believe in the idea of negative and positive as a general rule, but an uncomfortable experience or an ugly part of their personality. Why would they want to be in touch with something that is not them? It's not me. Well, it's maybe not the way you have a preference for expressing. That's the way that I would put it. But how did the two of you integrate that for you? How did that eventually come to make sense? What was this part of you coming up? this anger? What was it really? And what did it need?
And I will add that on my first treatment, that was just MDMA, I had only one integration session and no integration after that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was riding high for 5-6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started to come down from that wave pretty hard, because it was a high that I had never reached before. And even though you were so high, the coming down felt so steep that I was coming back into my anxiety again within about 2 months. And after the second and third treatment, I had, the therapy, psychotherapy once a week for 6 to 8 weeks. And I never experienced that peak down that I experienced the first time not having psychotherapy. So I am, my anecdotal data says that psychotherapy is as important as the medicine. At least I'm going to say as important, if not more, but definitely as important, because I kind of did my own control trial within my, one without the psychotherapy and one with.
We'd call that a crossover.
Yeah. Crossover, yeah. And I could definitely tell the difference.
Right. And so it helped you to sustain the benefits of your therapeutic experience.
Yes.
And I think one thing I would add here is that that does sort of jive with the idea, right, that psychedelics kind of make the sort of the ground fertile, right, of the brain, right, as if we use the plant analogy that you said, to encourage new growth, right, but it's all about how that growth occurs afterwards, right, that really seems to make a difference in the long run. And I think it's important to really own and recognize that, even if you look at the side effect data from a lot of the clinical trials that have been published, these are not easy experiences with, all rainbows and unicorns and, bliss and ecstasy. A lot of the people that go through these studies report a lot of, feelings of wanting to cry, feeling lonely, feeling sad, feeling depressed. I've seen some of the videos from the trials in the MDMA studies that MAPS has done as part of I went through the MDMA assisted therapist training program that MAPS has created. And, these folks there's a lot of emoting occurring, there's a lot of people crying and yelling and anger and fear. And, so it is not, it's not all bliss. And, but I think what that illustrates though, right, especially as, Gaby's story is a beautiful example of this, is that those things are necessary sometimes to experience in order for the healing to occur. When this idea, right, that like, that's not a part of me, that's not who I am, right? I don't want to experience these things. That is essentially going against the idea of you being a whole individual, right? You're disowning a part of yourself.
Right. You're repressing certain aspects, certain expressions.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And in my own personal experience, it's been when those edges come up, when I meet those uncomfortable places, I welcome it as a part of myself that is just wanting to be loved. And sometimes I can watch my mind or my ego struggle with whatever it is that's coming up. And I can actually lucidly be aware of my mind saying, I don't want to feel that. I don't want to go into that. That's not me. Why am I thinking about this? Right. And that to me, it's like the light bulb goes on and I go, okay, now this is where we turn toward that thing. This is where we relax the edges of our experience and be curious about why this is really here and what this needs. I always think of these little aspects like little children that are tugging at our clothes, being like, look at me, look at me, look at me. And we're like, no, I don't have time for you. I don't want to look at that. And I had the opportunity to go to a Joe Dispenza meditation retreat, Dr. Joe Dispenza, cool. And I'm actually going to another one in December. I just love his work, and I love the science that he brings to it, and this very grounded perspective of how energy gets trapped in our bodies, how emotion is energy in motion. And a lot of people are just opening up to this idea of our emotions actually having a visceral impact on our physiology and our organ systems and our brain chemistry. And for some, it seems woo-woo. It seems unfathomable that we're actually a holistic system. We have specialists for all different parts of the body, and that's great. But we're learning, I think, as humanity to become an integrated whole, not only just within ourselves, but with each other.
I want to add something to that because after the meeting that I had this morning, I think that part of what my job is, I cannot tell you how many people have been curious about psychedelics, but they don't mesh with the woo-woo people, right? They're businessmen and they're just like, but I was somebody that they trusted and I was somebody that they respected. They'd known each other. We've known each other for a while. And all of a sudden me coming through and saying, I did it. And this was, real. And I'm in a business suit, telling them this. That's how I think the masses are going to turn. It's almost like there's an in-between between the woo-woo and the scientific rigor, right? And how can you bring the science people a little bit closer to this line and the woo-woo people a little bit closer to here.
Bridging the gap.
And then having this sort of line where the majority of the people are. And the strategy on how to do that is kind of where I feel like I can play.
Yeah, no, I think you need people that can speak both languages, right? People that can kind of talk with the scientists and speak their language, and then the people that can talk about energy and chakras, and all these more woo-woo concepts.
And you need to get the trust from both sides, to be able to bring them together.
But they're really not incompatible, in my opinion. I think they're just different words to describe similar concepts, right? I mean, this idea of chakras, right? For example, as energy centers, that. I mean, there are a lot of ganglia going up and down the spine, right? That are concentrations of energy, right? Because what they're doing is they are sending electrochemical impulses, back and forth between the brain and the rest of the nervous system.
They're glandular systems.
Yeah,
every chakra is associated with an organ or glandular system.
Right.
Yeah.
So in my mind, they're just different terms
that all make their own chemicals and have their own little apothecaries happening.
Yes. And there's even emerging research coming out showing that at least some psychedelics can be profoundly anti-inflammatory as well.
Ooh, do go on.
Yeah, this is it's a newer area. I think a lot of the work that's been done has been done in animal models. Chuck Nichols over at LSU, I think, has done a lot of work in this area. But it does appear that, particularly in the brain, because the brain has its own sort of immune system, that psychedelics do have a very profound anti-inflammatory property.
Will you talk about why that's important for depression and
Sure.
Because a lot of people listening may not associate inflammation with things like depression or really disease at all. We don't really have a great schema of what that means at this point, in my opinion.
Yeah. So inflammation is, I think, been called like the silent epidemic,
Yep.
And we know now that it's associated with so many different types of diseases, both mental and physical, heart disease, diabetes, depression, right? And essentially inflammation is just part of your body's natural response, right? It's part of the immune system. It's involved in repair and regeneration and detecting, pathogens and responding to them. But the issue is when the inflammatory response becomes dysregulated. Part of that is that there is a whole hormonal and neuroendocrine and neuroimmune axis that is essentially a sort of a feedback system between the brain and the rest of the body. And so we know in depression, for example, that there are at least some subset of people with depression that have this really inflammatory phenotype where they have this dysregulated inflammation response. And there's some work showing that if you target that inflammation specifically, that will help to alleviate the depression in these individuals. It's kind of like when you're maybe ill and just starting to come down with a cold, you notice that your mood changes, right? That's probably the inflammatory response occurring in your body. I noticed this. I just was getting over a cold. We had to reschedule this podcast because of that, and I just, you don't feel as zesty for life, right? Things just don't.
Not zesty for life.
Not zesty for life at all,
Yeah.
And so there's a very much an interplay between the brain and body, the mind and the body, and inflammation is one of the key linking factors between those.
Oh yeah, and it's a self-perpetuating cycle, as I was sharing with the two of you, with my journey with Lyme's disease, and then the insane amount of inflammation that my body was experiencing and struggling to any food that I would eat, I would have an inflammatory response, and how that was feeding into the depression, right? And then I'm lethargic. I don't have any energy. I have brain fog, so I don't feel like working, or when I speak to people, I feel stupid. I can't put my thoughts together. I'm getting frustrated. I don't want to go anywhere. And how that was just feeding itself and feeding. So sometimes my inflammation was so erratic that I would eat something, do my bedtime routine, go to bed, and I would wake up and it would look like I had just grown several chins overnight. There'd be so much fluid underneath my chin. My face would be puffy. I actually have a Telegram channel, and a few weeks ago I posted photos of me during the peak of my Lyme and my inflammation, and now, it's hardly recognizable, the change I've undergone. And that's when I started to learn about inflammation and the brain specifically, and depression. And for me, sauna, infrared sauna, was a really, really big part of my detox journey from Lyme, reducing the inflammation. And so, yeah, everything that you're saying resonates with my own anecdotal experience as well.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure, I don't remember exactly where this is occurring, but I think there is a study looking at psychedelics for Lyme disease, if I remember correctly.
Cool.
And then maybe one as well for sort of long COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So I think
Mm-hmm.
people are already picking up on that,
Mm-hmm.
that perhaps psychedelics could be helpful for some of these inflammatory conditions.
Mm-hmm. I was going to add that also at Dell Medical School, one of the things that is coming down the pipeline as a project is a center for gut health and microbiome research.
Yes.
And so we are really looking at, 80% of our immune system is in our gut, and how does the gut-brain relationship work? And so that's I see some future collaborations between the two areas of excellence.
That sounds really interesting. I just will not be collecting the fecal samples.
No, I know. Let them do that.
Way to put a boundary down, Greg.
Yes, you have to lay down boundaries sometimes.
And just to close the loop on all this, when you said gut-brain connection, I was starting to scan my brain for when did I really confidently feel like my Lyme's disease chapter had ended. And of course, this is all completely my opinion, my anecdotal experience, but I couldn't help but feel like after I went to drink ayahuasca for the first time, I had 4 ceremonies. There was clearly a lot of purging that happened. And I kind of had this experience, like this plant material that I'm consuming. There's such powerful energy in here, yes, but also on a chemical level, like the alkaloids, everything that I was physically consuming, and then going through this really intense nervous system reset. Really having this sense within myself that my gut and my brain chose to reset during those first 4 ceremonies. And then I integrated, and then I went back for another 9. So that was a really, really big turning point for me as well, in agreeing to turn toward the emotional baggage that I now believe contributed to my susceptibility for Lyme. Of course, this is just my opinion, but what is an autoimmune disorder, right? And in a way, our body is attacking itself. And I had such low self-esteem. I was working insane hours in New York City, 60, 70 hours a week, very high stress job. I was in jobs where I was just very much told what to do. And I just had to accept what I was told, or at least I thought I had to just do what I was told, and I was following orders. And there was a lot of suppressing of my own desire and instinct. And so I believe that the experience of drinking ayahuasca and agreeing to turn toward the emotional factors that had contributed to the suppression, essentially. It was like things that I didn't want to look at, or parts of my personality that I was disallowing to express. And once I turned toward them, I was able to free an immense amount of physical energy from my body and really, really begin to heal.
Wow, that's amazing.
I think that before we finished, I just wanted to kind of say what sets our center apart from the other centers. And I think Charlie Nemiroff has a lot to do with it, and his dedication to childhood trauma. Greg, you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So, kind of relating to inflammation and, psychedelics is this idea that, what happens early on in life matters, right? In terms of your early life experiences. So my co-director, Dr. Nemiroff, is a sort of a world-renowned expert in early life adversity and childhood maltreatment, and how that can shape the brain, the nervous system, and the immune system to making people more predisposed to developing things like depression or post-traumatic stress disorder later in life. And the other thing that is really fascinating about this, and also sobering, is that these folks that are exposed to early life adversity don't respond as well to the treatments that we have. So antidepressants, for example, psychotherapy. Yeah, so they are a prime example of people that are probably underserved by our existing psychiatric treatment approaches. So we're particularly interested in seeing if psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted therapies might be the most helpful for these individuals. We're hoping soon to start a study that's going to be looking at people with depression and a history of early life adversity specifically, to really hone in on those individuals and then see if psychedelics combined with various forms of psychotherapy might be particularly helpful for allowing them to recover from depression.
Do we know why those with childhood trauma are particularly treatment resistant?
Yeah, part of it is probably related to the fact that the development of the brain it's sort of like a trajectory. And so early on in life, if you're exposed to a lot of stress, that sort of tips your trajectory of development in a certain direction. And that direction may be towards the type that is not more severe. For one, they tend to have more severe forms of psychopathology, but also two, they may have less adaptive resources to draw on.
Right.
It's kind of like they're already at a deficit.
They don't have the tools, and they're also creating these emotional set points too that are leading them in certain directions.
Correct. And some of this too might be related to inflammation as well.
And for lay terms, like your brain physically changes.
Right.
As you're growing up, when you're having constant stress applied to it. So
the pathways grow in a certain way. And that's why with what we know about the psychedelics and their potentiality to help us create new neural pathways, that's why this seems to be like it has some promise, some serious promise.
Yeah, that is definitely the hope. And, and I think at this point, there have not been any studies really selected for people with a history of early life trauma, for example. I would say probably in the MAPS MDMA studies, there's been a good number of people with, histories of child abuse and child neglect with PTSD, but it's a mix. You have a lot of first responders, veterans as well, who oftentimes also do have a history of early life trauma.
Do you feel to some degree, I mean, we're being very loose in our terminology of early life trauma, right? But do you feel to some degree each one of us has experienced early life trauma?
Yeah.
How would you define that?
It probably, yes. I think we've all experienced experiences in our life early on that maybe stick out in our minds as being particularly stressful, particularly challenging. I think the thing that might set it apart in terms of it being a really detrimental experience is the how extreme it is and how chronic it is. So if you've had maybe a couple challenging experiences growing up, but you in general had a pretty loving household you grew up in, most of the rest of your experiences were fairly normal or within the range of kind of normal development. That may not be as bad as if you have a lot of chronic low grade, for example, verbal abuse from your parents, or even physical abuse or sexual abuse, for example. Sexual abuse is probably one of the forms of early life trauma that is pretty much always in the category of being traumatic. I don't think there would be any kind of normative forms of that.
I had my friend Will Reason on this show to talk about trauma, and I loved the way that he described it to me. He was talking about when we're differentiating, was this a big T trauma, a little T trauma? He said the size of the trauma is not necessarily about the event or the nature of the event itself, but rather whether or not we had the support to move through and integrate the social support and other support systems to be able to move through that trauma. So
Charlie also talks about the resiliency genes, right? It's also about genetically what you were dealt with, right? And so if you have the resiliency gene and you have big trauma, but you have the tools to manage it, then it's not going to affect you the same way that if you don't have these quote unquote resiliency genes.
I had no idea there was a resiliency gene.
Well, it's not just one, but your genetic kind of predisposition or your genetic load, for example, can play a big part.
I actually want to just touch on this for 1 second because oftentimes people will say, oh, depression is predisposed in my family. And I just briefly, I don't know if it's in your area of expertise at all, but I just briefly would love to talk about epigenetics as like a very, very introductory fashion for people and talking about this idea of turning genes on and off and how that can work and how psychedelics can play a part in that.
Yeah. So I will preface this by saying it's not my area of expertise, but I can tell you a little bit about what I know, and I think it's right. But I would say fact check me if possible. So so epigenetics is essentially a whole field of study that is all about the way in which your genes are utilized, I guess, by your body, we might say. So your genetic code is kind of hardwired, right, in terms of the actual base pairs and the sequencing. But it's the way in which that information is read, we might say, off your genes or your genetic material, your DNA, that is kind of the field of epigenetics and how that information is kind of translated from your genes into things like proteins and the whole sort of system there. There is some emerging work suggesting that psychedelics could impact this process. Some of it involves what's called DNA methylation, which is essentially the ease with which your DNA can be read by things like I'm drawing a blank on the molecular terms for this, but essentially the way in which the messenger RNA is sort of read off your genes and then created or translated into proteins. But it's a very wild and interesting area. It is really kind of getting more to the idea that, yes, your genetic code is kind of hard set when you're born, but that's not the only thing that really matters. It's also the way in which that information is translated off the genetic code that really makes a difference as well.
And it can kind of go both ways, meaning like, for example, schizophrenia, right? Like somebody has that in their family, but they're not expressing schizophrenia until they're in their mid-20s or something because there's some kind of event that triggers that to turn on, and then now they're schizophrenic, right?
Right. Yeah. So that's kind of the interplay between your experiences and your genes, and that's sort of the intermediary of that might be sort of epigenetic processes.
And so, do you believe then it's possible for these mental health disorders that maybe are genetic to potentially be affected or turned off, the light switch turned off with the use of psychedelics are not, because, again, I'm going to throw it back to Joe Dispenza's work, who is very much a proponent of this and believes that we can absolutely influence the way that we're expressing these genes. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think it is possible. It's probably not as simple as a light switch kind of turning on and off, but there is certainly, I think, ways in which we could, and I think we're just beginning to move towards this, but ways to intelligently influence the way in which our genetic information is utilized by our body, whether that be through certain experiences or certain, chemicals, for example, like psychedelics or other kinds of epigenetically focused interventions. But I think it's certainly it's an area it's exploding at the moment in terms of interest and research, and I think there's a lot to be discovered there that might be helpful for medicine in the future.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. In our final few minutes here, I'm going to open it up to the both of you if there's anything else that you would really love to add and tell our listeners about today. And then in closing, I would also love for you to tell people where they can connect with you if they're interested in donating or supporting or connecting with the center.
Do you want to go first, Gaby?
Sure. So I'm happy to connect with anybody that is interested in knowing more about the center. I can leave you my email. I'm happy to, I welcome all people that are interested in knowing more. We are, in terms of our plans, so we only have $300,000 left to raise for this phase 1 with the 2 projects that Greg talked about. For what we're looking for, phase 2 in the future, we're looking at postpartum depression and treating women that have postpartum depression with psilocybin. And I don't know if Greg wants to say more about that.
Cool.
And also people that have had cancer and are dealing with now PTSD. I guess 1 in 5 per people that have had cancer now have PTSD. And so
these are cancer survivors.
Cancer survivors.
With PTSD from their experience, their emotional experience of going through the cancer process. Okay.
So we're probably looking at another $3 million to take enhance what we currently have and take those 2 new projects. Eventually, I would like to endow the center. So not just go to project by project, but, we would welcome a $10 million gift that will give the center operational support every year. And of course, there will be a naming possibility for that. My email is Gabriela, that's Gabriela, Poler, Poler, at austin.utexas.edu. I'm going to have to double check that.
Great. We can put
But
it
my
in
cell
the show
phone number
notes,
is 646-425-5478. If people want to text me, I'm fine with that too. I'm just super excited to also, as we move along with this, incorporate this is at the University of Texas. It is at Dell Medical School, but it is at the University of Texas. And so we are talking to the law school and have the law school have curriculum on psychedelics. And we're talking about Macombs and having, the Macomb College of Business put some entrepreneurships within psychedelics. And we have, we're really looking at, the sociology department and all these indigenous compounds and how that affects them. So I think the University of Texas really can be a pioneer, not only in the mental health space, but just how psychedelics affect all the different areas, and have, a space in that and curriculum there. So also wanted to say that. I think that's it.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thank you. So let's see, parting thoughts might be, I guess first off, easy stuff would be contact info.
Yep.
So we have an email set up for the center. It's fairly easy. It's psychedelics@utexas.edu.
Perfect.
It's fairly straightforward, and people are welcome to reach out. We get a lot of requests for, our like when we're starting and that kind of thing. We do have these, so the Gold Star Spouses study is up and running, and we are recruiting for that.
Great.
So if you are a spouse of a veteran that's been lost in the line of duty, please get in contact with us. We'd be happy to speak with you and potentially get you enrolled in that study. And that's being done in conjunction with Jesse Gould and the Heroic Hearts Project. He's a great guy. It's a great
shout out to Jesse.
Yeah. And then we just actually got IRB approval for another study that will be starting soon, also in conjunction with Heroic Hearts Project, which is going to be in Special Operations Forces veterans, so Navy SEALs and Army Rangers. These guys suffer from a lot of traumatic brain injury, PTSD, depression, addictions, and we're going to be treating them with ibogaine, which is an African hallucinogen. Or rather, we won't be treating them at Dell Med, but we'll be sending them to a affiliated retreat center that works with the Heroic Hearts Project, and then we'll be assessing them at Dell Med before and after. So those are going to be starting quite soon. We have another study that is going to be starting up probably early in 2023, which is we're going to be a dosing site for the COMPASS phase 3 trial for psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. And then we have our first large center trial, which is focused on this combination of psilocybin and repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation for treatment-resistant depression, which will also be starting probably early in 2023. As Gaby mentioned, we are actively moving forward in this area. We're going to be doing some work looking at psilocybin for postnatal depression or postpartum depression. That's going to be led by our perinatal psychiatry or women's mental health expert, Dr. Jeff Newport. We also will be looking at psilocybin for individuals with following a cancer diagnosis and or treatment that have PTSD, and that'll be led by Dr. Garrett Key. So a lot of exciting stuff coming up, and just parting words for people. I think that if people are suffering and they are interested in potentially exploring psychedelics for mental health purposes, that I would just encourage them to try to seek it out through a way that is going to be as safe as possible for them, and whether it be through research or at the moment, I guess that's really the only kind of approach available in the U.S. And so I would definitely encourage them to contact us, or to go on another good website is clinicaltrials.gov. That lists all the clinical trials that are going on in the U.S. All of the psychedelic studies will be listed on there. So I would just encourage people to be safe about this, to be smart, and to try to receive this treatment through the most legitimate means possible.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank the both of you for all that you're doing, pioneering this area, and for all of your time today, your stories, your energy. I adore the two of you. I'm so happy that Martine connected us. This has blown me out of the water, and I'm so grateful to know the both of you and to be championing you. Why is that word so hard to say right now? I want to be your champion for this, and I do hope that some who are listening will feel inspired to learn more and to connect and to donate handsomely to what you're doing. So thanks again.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Haley. It's been a pleasure.